So welcome. I am so incredibly excited to be here with you today. My name is Eleanor Bramwell, and I have the incredible honor of being one of the co-founders of Inner Path Psychedelic Assisted Therapy Center. We are the first psychedelic center in Baltimore, and it has been a true honor to be part of this conversation expanding. I'm the primary microdosing team member at our center. I built out a lot of this program, and I have trained most of our therapists that offer microdosing. It's been something I've been offering for many, many years at this point. And so I am so passionate about it and so excited and really, really thrilled that it's here in Baltimore and that I get to be here with you tonight. This is one of my favorite quotes because psychedelic medicine is so incredibly powerful. We are so lucky as a people to have this medicine at this time. And when psychedelics are used responsibly and with proper caution, Stanislav Grof says that they could be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology, or what the telescope is for astronomy. That psychedelics could be such a powerful tool for us in the field of mental health that we could effectively have a new telescope. And I happen to agree with him. So psychedelic is a beautiful word. It stems from Latin, from two different words, psyche, the mind, and delos, to reveal, which if we extrapolate means mind revealing or manifesting. It's an opportunity to make the unconscious conscious. And for those of you that have ever had a large dose journey, it is pretty wild what lies beneath and what you can be able to access in these spaces and bring forward into your waking life. Microdosing is different than a megadose. where there are no perceptual effects. It is non-hallucinogenic. So one should be able to engage in normal activities like momming and going to school and driving a car and working. So we tend not to be bringing forward the unconscious material in the same way, in such a large way. It is thought to be 1/10 of a normal dose, right? So it's 0.1 gram if you're speaking of psilocybin. However, microdosing can be any substance. We'll talk a little bit about that in the future, but for today's purposes, we are discussing microdosing, psychedelic medicine, in particular and specifically psilocybin. So a macrodose, this is a full-on journey. We'll talk a little bit about the breakdown. So a microdose is 0.1. A mini dose is anywhere from 0.3 to 1 grams. 1 gram to 3 gram is a standard dose, and then 3 to 5 grams is considered a hero's dose. So we have these different terminologies that have been given to us by Third Wave and the Microdosing Institute to determine what bracket we are in. Psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, have been used for a very long time. And in fact, the McKennas believe that when we were evolving, when we were Homo erectus, we ate psychedelic medicine, we ate psilocybin, and that is part of what supported the brain in growing to this really beautiful, complex thing and us evolving into Homo sapiens. The result of psilocybin was sharper cognition, a larger prefrontal cortex, faster reflexes, and expanded senses. And if you've ever had a macro journey of psilocybin, you may have experienced things like tasting sound or hearing color. And that is part of what they believe is how it evolved the brain. However, we do know that indigenous cultures have been using psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, for a very long time. And there's archaeological remnants of cave drawings. The oldest known one is the Selva Pascali caves in Europe. However, they have been found all over the world, in northern Scandinavia and in South and Central America. There are really beautiful cave drawings. And in fact, we did a whole webinar on the history and the indigenous anthropological use as we understand it throughout history. In 2015, psilocybin and microdosing in particular really picked up steam. The Rolling Stone and Forbes both put out articles on microdosing for mental and physical health. And now there are a lot of places that are researching microdosing for all kinds of things like cluster headaches, inflammatory pain, traumatic brain injury. And one of the reasons so much of this research is for things like migraines and traumatic brain injury and cluster headaches is because the action psilocybin has in our brain neurologically is really very interesting. It's fascinating. And we'll be talking more about that later in this webinar. Dr. James Fadiman, he's pretty cool. And he popularized microdosing in his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journeys. Shortly thereafter, that is when Tim Ferriss, the Rolling Stones, and Forbes all started putting out articles about microdosing. Tim Ferriss has a podcast with more than 900 million downloads, which is significant. And when he began to speak about microdosing, a lot of movement happened. There was a lot of traction. There was a book in 2016 that was a best-selling title called A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. And then several years later, mycologist Paul Stamets released a documentary called Fantastic Fungi that Netflix carries. And it is incredibly emotionally impactful and explores all of the research that has been going on at places like Johns Hopkins and other universities on the benefit of psilocybin. So again, you can microdose anything. In fact, people can take a microdose of all sorts of things, of various herbal remedies, but microdosing typically means psilocybin or LSD. For today's purposes, we will be speaking about the benefit, the action of psilocybin. The common protocols that have the most research are the Fadiman protocol, which is 1 day on and 2 days off. The Stamets stack, which is 4 days on and 3 days off. Mycology, psychology, 5 days on, 2 days off. And so the flow is the number of days on, followed by a short tolerance break. So the 2 days off, the 3 days off, the 2 days off, those are the tolerance breaks. And stacking is when we are combining the microdose, the psychedelic medicine, with something else. For example, functional mushrooms like lion's mane or niacin. And Stamets, who has, again, really popularized functional mushrooms. He has the most popular functional mushroom supplements on the market. He adds lion's mane and niacin and believes that those two substances really increase cognitive function and neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is the brain's ability to grow, to become more neuroplastic. So microdosing is, when you are doing it intentionally, a really beautiful journey. Some people simply take a microdose and then they go off into life. However, if you are intentionally microdosing, this is the protocol with the most research behind it, the most evidence. Preparation. And preparation is a really important time to begin to identify your goals and start to explore tools that you can utilize to maximize the benefit of the medicine. It's really helpful to work with a microdosing coach because they can determine which protocol, which dosing protocol is best to meet your unique goals. They can offer skill-based education that meets you where you are to help you achieve your goals. And they can also even help you figure out which strain of psilocybin is best for your unique makeup. they all have different actions. For example, some psilocybin is very stimulating. It's best taken in the morning. And some psilocybin is slower and better to take at nighttime before bed. It's suggested to observe yourself, noticing throughout the dose day and the day after the dose day your experiences. What's happening in your body, your emotional state, your bandwidth, your mood, your perception, what's going on for you. And they've suggested that this observation stage is actually one of the most important to be able to take advantage of the changes that are happening neurologically. Of course, we need to calibrate. So psilocybin is a medicine that is digested, which means that things like metabolism, metabolic rate, physical activity, body size, I'm less than 5'3", I'm a smaller person, which means my body will have different metabolic input needs than someone who is a much larger person. So although we start with 0.1, some of our clients, we do move up to 0.2. And it depends, again, on which medicine strain they're using, because certain strains are much stronger. For example, steel magnolias are a very strong strain of psilocybin. And then integration. So this occurs on the days between doses and also after the 6 to 12-week protocol. We'll talk a little bit about this, but it's important to recognize that psilocybin increases neuroplasticity. So the integration window is really a sacred time where you get to leverage the neuroplasticity and make changes that are sustainable, that last across a lifetime, like increasing vagal tone or your ability to self-regulate or rewiring the brain. And there is more and more and more research coming out. In fact, Harvard Medical School cites that out of a research study where they had quite a few folks microdosing, that every participant noticed improvements in mood and mental health. And these improvements were consistent across gender, age, and presence of all other mental health concerns, which is really, really encouraging. In a randomized study with 34 participants, half received psilocybin and half received placebo. There were some really intriguing subjective effects. People tended to feel happier and more creative. And there were changes in brainwaves reported on an EEG machine. And again, this is with microdosing. There is a tremendous amount more research on mega or macrodosing than microdosing for right now. For quite a while, there were some issues and concerns and criticism with psilocybin research because all of the research participants were self-selected. They were applying to be in the research study. And of those applicants, only 1 in about 60 would be approved to be in the research study. And they were ruling out people that had a lot of pre-existing mental health conditions. However, that's starting to change. Compass Pathways, which is a fascinating company, they are running research on psilocybin right now at Shepherd Pratt in conjunction. And they just ran a research study on folks with type 2 bipolar. 12 out of 14 of the participants, the patients in the study, no longer meet the criterion for type 2 bipolar disorder, which is, if any of you have ever worked with folks, know anyone, or yourself experience, it's a very, very, very hard place to be. And so this is incredibly emotionally encouraging. Now, these results are preliminary, and they're going to continue tracking these participants, these patients, for a period of time before they finish the paper, but it's super exciting. And as Compass expands, they're going to continue running more and more research on more and more different populations to explore the efficacy of psilocybin across different strata. So I'll pause there for a second before we keep going and just see if anyone has any questions about what a microdose is, any excitement, anything to add before I go on. Great, okay, wonderful. So diving back in. Okay. So from this research, we can see that psilocybin has incredibly promising results. And the more research that comes out, the more excited we become about both macrodosing and about microdosing. And just to name it, again, this is a microdosing webinar, but we will do one on macrodosing in the future. And there are certain important key things to take into consideration for psilocybin to be effective for different populations. For example, people with treatment-resistant depression, they do much better with 2 mega doses coupled with therapy with their eyes closed and a blindfold. So there are little things we're learning, like the blindfold, that we did not before know make a huge difference for the outcome. Psilocybin, and one of the reasons psilocybin has such incredibly promising effects is because of what happens, the action on the brain. In a recent research study, they had rats receive psilocybin, and within 30 minutes, brain hemispheres that do not normally communicate with each other were rapidly communicating. There was a huge lighting up of the brain. And we know that psilocybin increases BDNF, brain-derived growth neurotrophic factor, which is kind of like miracle growth for the brain. When someone receives psilocybin, psychedelic medicine, the brain floods with this hormone that encourages growth and differentiation of new neurons and synapses. So we are seeing this in research. Even with microdosing, the brain is still flooding with BDNF, which again is promoting neuroplasticity. This is a really exciting time in the field of neuroplasticity. We now understand that the brain is incredibly moldable. Although it's fixed, we can change the brain. We can support it in completely rewiring. After someone had a stroke, we used to say, gosh, we're so sorry. There's really not much we can do to help you. And now, after someone has a stroke, they undergo rigorous occupational and physical therapy. And we see that new areas of the brain can be recruited to learn how to lift arms and talk and move. And in fact, Dr. Norman Dowges, a neuroplasticity expert, he has all kinds of case studies about folks that were born, for example, with only half a brain. The brain really can change and grow a lot, which is incredibly exciting. It opens a lot of possibility for us. Psilocybin has a very interesting effect in increasing neuroplasticity and increasing the brain's ability to change itself. And the reason is because psilocybin binds with the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of the serotonin receptors. And it happens to be involved in learning, memory, and cognition. So because psilocybin is binding with that receptor, most of these receptors happen to be in the prefrontal cortex. That's the place where we're doing a lot of learning and memory and executive functioning. Just a tiny bit of psilocybin can support us in neurological changes. So I'm going to stop here for a second. This is really important. People ask, well, if psilocybin is binding with a serotonin receptor and SSRIs are binding with a serotonin neuroreceptor, how come SSRIs are not that effective and have a tremendous amount of side effects that can be terrifying and concerning? And the binding with the 5-HT2A receptor, that just specific part of the serotonin, is what makes the difference. We don't yet fully understand why, but that is what is demonstrating, although still binding with serotonin, it is creating huge lasting change, sometimes across a lifetime, without the crazy side effects. Some of the 5-H2A receptors are also in the visual cortex. There's quite a lot of them there, which is why with larger doses of psilocybin, people tend to have those visual hallucinations, which is what psilocybin is so sort of hallmarked for. Okay. So So again, it's really important to recognize that psilocybin is really important in all kinds of aspects, including mood, bowel movements, all kinds of things in our nervous system. And so simply having a little bit of psilocybin in our system often helps people feel better because of the serotonin binding. However, coaching really matters. When someone is microdosing, right, they tend to have a greater window of tolerance. They generally feel much better. And that can be really, really useful, for example, if you're moving, if you have a new baby, if it's a stressful time at work. Just simply taking a microdose can expand your window of tolerance, giving you more capacity to manage the stress of every day and generally feel better, again, because it binds with the serotonin receptor. However, when people are simply microdosing without doing intentional coaching practices, after the protocol ends, the benefits don't last. Because of course, if you keep doing the same things while you're microdosing, you keep doing the same things. So the dosing window is a sacred window when we can initiate lasting change. Remember, the brain is really neuroplastic. We have this dump of BDNF. It's communicating with all kinds of places it doesn't normally communicate, which means we can more easily rewire the brain and create lasting change. My favorite analogy is that of a mud field. Imagine that it hasn't rained in a really, really long time, and the field is dry dirt. And there's these deep grooves that a tractor has been traveling on over and over and over. And that someone is feeling really stuck, like they are stuck in those grooves that are so deep, and the truck just can't quite get out of those deeply stuck grooves. The psilocybin, the psychedelic medicine, is like a giant rainstorm that makes the field soft and pliable and mud-like. And then with intentional integration practices, you can drive the tractor slightly differently in the field, creating new grooves, creating new potential. So while the brain is neuroplastic, it's a really sacred window to engage in practices that create change. And if you do, research demonstrates that if you engage in a practice for 8 weeks consecutively, that can be long enough to create a deep enough groove in the brain to create lasting change even after you stop. So we'll talk just a little bit more about this. Okay. Okay, there we go. So learning creates new pathways and remembering maintains them. Every time you learn something new, it creates a new pathway. When you practice, it maintains them. So think about this. When someone is a really amazing guitarist, they don't stay really good if they don't practice, right? After they've learned, they've created the pathways, but by practicing the guitar, that's how they maintain those pathways. Dr. Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize in 2000, and his discovery was very cool. He demonstrated that after you learn something new, neural connections double in that area. However, they prune apart in hours today if not maintained. So when we start learning new things, we create the new pathway, and then when we practice it, we maintain them. And during the microdosing protocol, we have intentional practices that are tailored for each person to create new pathways that are then maintained. Let's talk a little bit about how important the mind-body connection is here. So every thought floods the body with hormones. Anger is not an idea. Anger is like a surge of heat, a contraction of the gut, tension in the body, bracing of muscles. That's not happening in your mind. It's happening in the body. When you wake up from a nightmare, the nightmare didn't actually happen, but it's feeling in your body like it did. It feels really real. Research now demonstrates that we think 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day. which means 60 to 80,000 times per day, we are flooding the body with hormones over and over and over. And it's important to acknowledge that 90% of our thoughts we had yesterday. And so whatever repetitive thought loop you have, whether it's conscious or unconscious, is flooding the body over and over and over with hormones, reaffirming that paradigm. When we rewire the brain, we have an opportunity to change our hormonal baseline. This is actually really important and highly significant. Happiness is relatively predetermined. Research now demonstrates that if something epic happens, there is a short spike in happiness followed by a drastic dip back to your general baseline. Similarly, if something really challenging happens, there tends to be a short dip followed by a spike, whoop, right back up to your sort of standard baseline. And research believes that part of this is because stress hormones are highly addictive. And so whatever hormonal cocktail we have become accustomed to in our body, we find ways of making sure we stay within that bracket. Which means that if we rewire the brain and the thoughts that are happening on autopilot while we're driving down the road are different, remember our thoughts flood our body with hormones, we can start to change our baseline, the cocktail. So while you are taking psychedelic medicine, you can do incredibly intentional and beautiful practices that are tailored to you to rewire the brain and start flooding it with new hormones. Of course, okay, whoa. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about microdose coaching, but there are many other things in addition to neuroplasticity and brain rewiring that can be really helpful. But we'll talk a little bit more about who microdosing is for and who it's not for first. So I would like to first acknowledge that I am not a doctor and I do not prescribe anyone anything. Of course, it's important to consult with your physician if you're planning to combine, stop, or phase out any medication that you have been prescribed. Unfortunately, no one is sufficiently knowledgeable in the field of microdosing to be able to advise you on contraindications. However, we do know that there is a list of medications that it is encouraged to not cause any adverse side effects. And there is a list of medications that we know you should not take with psilocybin. However, all of the research that is coming out is demonstrating that microdosing is extremely safe. In fact, Dr. David Presti, who is a professor of neurobiology at the University of California, Berkeley, and an expert on the effects of drugs on the brain, has stated publicly many times that microdosing is much safer than taking antidepressants. The risk is quite low. And if we look at some of the statistics of selected drugs, we will see in orange that is harm to others and in blue that is harm to self. We will see that mushrooms have the very lowest harm to self or harm to others. And that in fact, many other things like alcohol or even things that are prescribed like methadone have much higher risk profiles, or even some other pharmaceuticals like benzos. It's pretty wild how little statistically harm is demonstrated to self or other when using these medicines. There are a few risks. So some people experience anxiety. Anecdotally, very few of our clients experience anxiety, but it does happen. When that occurs, we drop their dose, and that tends to resolve the anxiety. Stomach upset or nausea, this is a really interesting one, and it makes sense. You're taking a dehydrated plant material that is then swelling up in the body and is really hard to digest. So for folks that have stomach upset or nausea, what we do is we invite them to open the capsule, drop it in water, allow it to rehydrate, add some honey and some ginger, and that tends to take care of the nausea or stomach upset for folks. This is really interesting. Increased emotional instability or fatigue or difficulty sleeping. And again, this is happening in maybe 2% of the folks we're working with. But what it seems to us is that if someone has been in a sympathetic fight flight state for a very long time and they come out of it, they tend to be exhausted. If someone has a lot of emotions that they have repressed and not addressed, the psilocybin almost acts as a decomposer, and things start coming up that they're ready to metabolize and move through. And in that case, of course, this is another reason it's really important to be working with a therapist or a microdosing coach. I personally have never worked with someone who experienced headaches with microdosing, and I've worked with a lot of people, but it is listed as a potential risk. And again, no one I've ever worked with has had that, but it's important to let folks know that that could occur. What's really great though, is if you stop microdosing, all of this would end. There is such a short half-life of the medicine that these symptoms do not carry on. Microdosing is not recommended for people under the age of 18 because their brains are still so rapidly changing and stabilizing and rewiring. Microdosing is not recommended with alcohol or other drugs. Microdosing is not recommended when pregnant or breastfeeding because there have been no studies done to evaluate the safety. However, there are huge movements like the microdosing mom movement, where women who have just given birth are microdosing to support them in feeling more regulated, in having a greater window of tolerance, and having a greater capacity to self-regulate during such an important developmental stage. And they are pushing for research to be done with breastfeeding moms. There are a few medications we recommend that it's recommended to not microdose with because there could be danger. So lithium or tramadol. Until the bipolar 2 research study results have been finalized, bipolar is currently not on the list of things to microdose with if you have a clinical diagnosis. If you or anyone in your close nuclear family has a diagnosis of psychosis. So some people think that when you are feeling very emotionally overwhelmed, like you're going through a huge grief process, that's a great time to microdose because it tends to offer greater window of tolerance. At Inner Path, we ask you not to join us for a microdosing program at that time because again, it can heighten the experiences that you're having. Senses are often heightened, and we instead support you in creating more regulation and resource before a microdosing protocol. Folks with tinnitus, it has been suggested that this might not be a great protocol for them. That said, we have worked with several people who had tinnitus and self-elected to microdose anyway, and their tinnitus went away. And then men with color blindness, again, recommend recognizing that psilocybin is binding with the 5-HT2A receptor in the visual cortex. So there is a lot of benefit that is demonstrated and documented. There are quite a few studies that are showing when folks are microdosing, they tend to enter states of flow more easily. This is also known as being in the zone, when you lose a sense of self or time. This happens for some people when they're reading a book or practicing art or meditating or riding a bicycle or playing some kind of physical game. And research has demonstrated that flow states are a very important criterion for well-being, which is very cool. More balanced mood, lessened anxiety, lessened depression. Improved focus and concentration, which is one of the reasons they are beginning to research microdosing for ADHD. Increased problem-solving capabilities, and this makes sense because psilocybin, one of the actions is binding with the 5-HT2A receptors, and again, those are mostly in the prefrontal cortex, which is really all about cognition and executive function. So it makes sense that we would have a better and increased ability to solve problems, increase productivity, right? There is more focus and concentration. As psychedelics grow, more and more companies are beginning to explore their use for things like Alzheimer's and dementia, which is really promising and exciting. There's some preliminary studies out for that as well. We've noticed, and there is research demonstrating that folks tend to have improved sleep, more physical energy, enhanced sensory perception, both of their emotional state, their physical body, right? They have a better connection with their soma, their physical body, decreased pain levels, decreased PMS symptoms. It's very cool. Psilocybin is used for all kinds of addiction and eating disorders, which is very, very cool. And there's some promising research out on that. And again, all of the neurological things like migraines, cluster busters, cluster headaches, TBI, because of the neuroplastic action that psilocybin has. Folks tend to feel a deeper sense of presence, increased awareness of their emotional state, greater ability to connect with other humans at an emotional plane of depth, an increased sense of wonder and belonging, unity, and connection to self and others. There tends to be increased gratitude for life. And although this is very challenging to quantify, there is a lot of research that is trying to explore how people tend often to have an increased experience of spirituality or something greater than themselves. In fact, Johns Hopkins ran a research study where they gave psilocybin to clergy because they thought that these people had a better command of languaging around mystical experiences and divinity and connection to something greater. We're trying to understand more about this really wild side effect. It's funny to call it a side effect. So of course, again, microdosing, you can microdose, and it will give you an opportunity to have a greater window of tolerance, to be better able to manage the stress of everyday life. But if you stop microdosing, when you stop microdosing, those benefits dissolve. So this new frontier of mental health is combining microdosing with all kinds of therapeutic practices, like internal family systems. If the brain is more neuroplastic and you have gone in and met an exiled part, you're going to be better able to rewire the brain and the system in unburdening that part. So it's really, really, really cool in breaking down some of the rigid defense mechanisms and creating space to do deeper work. Again, people have a greater sensory awareness. So somatic therapies like somatic experiences can be much more effective when combined with microdosing. Very excited to share that at InnerPath, we do microdose coaching, both in a one-on-one format, and we also do it in a group format. And right now we are forming an 8-week group container. The classes will be offered virtually, one evening a week. We're still determining what date and time. This comes with a manual and a self-reflection journal. And it also comes with the one-on-one therapy sessions that are highly individualized. So people will be learning all of the didactic or psychoeducation to really rewire the brain and increase vagal tone, increase the ability to self-regulate. We have a beautiful manual, a really beautiful self-worth journal for at home. And then again, they will get 3 sessions one-on-one with a therapist. So here are some of the resources we integrated into this webinar. And yeah, curious if anyone has any questions. Okay. Well, InnerPath, in addition to doing microdose coaching, we also offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. That is always an in-person offering. And we have a variety of other holistic therapies. We are in the heart of Mount Washington, and we are feeling very honored and very excited to be the very first psychedelic center here in Baltimore. You can find us at InnerPath Baltimore. Oh, there's a question in the chat window. Yeah, go for it. If you want, you can just unmute yourself, Meg. I can also unmute you. Oh. Let's see here.
You hear me?
I can. Hi, Meg.
Hi. Well, my name's not Meg. That's a mistake, but that's okay.